about Saul and David. We are reading through the Bible. We are in First Samuel chapter 18 through, I think, 26 or so. This is the last couple of days reading. And there's a lot, of course, in here to talk about if we want to. It's not as much about the kind of big picture narrative, overview that we've been talking about going on here, but there's, of course, a lot of time spent in this book of First Samuel, like at least half of it, on this kind of ongoing Saul and David thing. There's this overlap between it's interesting in the Bible, this kind of idea of the overlap of things. In the New Testament, we have this idea of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is now at hand, and yet we're to pray for the kingdom to come. So there's the old world and the new world that Jesus inaugurates, and they overlap, right? So someday it's going to be all restored, but right now it's broken, and yet God is at work. There's this overlap. Well, in this time period that we're reading about in First Samuel, Saul is the king that does not remain faithful to God, and so God's favor and blessing is withdrawn from him in that role. And David is anointed as the next king, and yet Saul is still king. So there's this overlap here, and it's a stressful overlap in a way. Saul is showing himself to be a failure as a king, a failure as a disciple, a failure as in almost every way. He's paranoid. He's so concerned for his own reputation, his own power, his own whatever, and he's jealous and angry at David. Not really so much because of anything that David does specifically, but just because of the adoration, the attention that David gets, and the success that God gives him in the endeavors that he undertakes. In the midst of that, so that's if we're talking about the sort of big picture of this. This time, not the big picture of the biblical overview, but right now, the big picture is that this overlap. Saul's, kingship is winding down. We'll be at the end of First Samuel. We'll see here in the next day or two. David's is going to be ramping up, but in the midst of that, there's some really interesting other stories that are going on. One of those is the relationship between David and Jonathan. Right, Jonathan is King Saul's son. Unlike his dad, Jonathan is humble. He's righteous. And he, in the midst of the conflict between his dad and David, Jonathan does, want to honor his dad, Saul the king, but he also has this deep connection with David. And it's so wonderful, I think, that connection between Jonathan and David, because I guess partially because I feel like relationships between men are not great. Like it doesn't seem like men are very good at having deep relationships with each other, with friends. We keep it kind of sometimes surface level, superficial. But Jonathan and David have a deep connection with one another, and they make a commitment to one another. And it's just cool to see that. The fact that, sometimes people will kind of make accusations of this, of being some kind of homosexual type relationship, really to me just says how messed up we are, and that we assume that any kind of relational intimacy between people has to be, related to romance or sexuality. And that's just dumb, but that's the state of our culture today. I don't like it, but this kind of, I think, helps to reset some of what's possible. And you think, when you read things about in the New Testament, the way that Paul, for example, talked about some of his companions, and the emotional language that he would use for his connection with them, it just brings us to something that's deeper than what we so often experience. And I just I like that. So just a couple examples of that. Chapter 18, beginning of 18. After David finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. Now, again, that sounds like, oh, that's super, whatever. Love your neighbor as yourself is the kind of baseline thing we've already seen in Leviticus 19:18, right? And of course, Jesus will repeat that as well. So why does that to sort of say he loved him as he loved himself? Why does that potentially sound so unusual to us when it's kind of just a specific one-person application of what we are biblically required to do? Again, why is it that we can't say to other people outside of a parental or romantic relationship, I love you? Again, I think Scripture invites us into something deeper than we've tended to track with in our own lives at times. So verse 3, Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. This idea of covenant we've seen primarily so far with Abraham and Moses, right? The relationship between God and his people, either a person, a family, or a bigger group of people. But covenants can also be made between individuals, between nations, between all kinds of things, right? They're deep, they're significant, but there's a breadth of the way that the covenant language can be used. And of course, we talk about that. One of the primary ways we talk about that in the human terms is a covenant of marriage. But that's, of course, there's all kinds of covenants that can be made. So I like that. It's really a significant thing. We see not long after that in chapter 18, just some examples of the jealousy that Saul has. So there, David is really successful, in killing, of course, the giant Goliath and other military campaigns. We see things like this happen again and again, and they come back, and people, the women came out from the towns as they're returning to meet King Saul, and they're dancing, right, and playing these instruments or whatever, and they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And the very next thing is, and Saul became angry, right? So he's angry because he's jealous. So hey, if you want to be jealous, dude, why didn't you go up against Goliath, right? You're the king. You're supposed to be the one who leads people in battle. And David had the courage to do it, and you didn't. So what do you want? Like, what do you expect? You just want honorary stuff? We're not doing anything. I mean, give me a break, Saul, right? Yeah, he just sounds to me whiny. I don't know. He thought, so he was angry. This refrain displeased him, and they have credited David with tens of thousands. He thought, but me only thousands. I'm going to give it whiny. I think he's whiny. What more can he get but the kingdom? I mean, so the picture being painted of Saul here is he's pretty petty. He's pretty self-centered. He is not the king that these people need by any stretch of the imagination, right? So what do I want to say? So as the narrative goes on, Saul gives one of his daughters, Michal, in verse 20 of chapter 18, as his wife. But then he's mad because she loves him. I don't know what he expected. And this is an interesting just comment that's made here at the end of chapter 18, verse 29. Saul became more angry and afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. So Saul decided that David was going to be his enemy. Why? Again, it's just So chapter 20 has more about David and Jonathan. Jonathan is really an interesting character, again, because he's in a pretty impossible situation. He's the son of this king who's we've been seeing the picture of him, right? He's not a good dude. He's not rational, reasonable, or anything else. And yet, Jonathan has his place here, but he talks back isn't the right word. He challenges his father. He doesn't just say yes, yes, dad, yes, king, whatever you say. He's in a position where he, not disrespectfully, I don't think, but he challenges him. So I'm in chapter 20, verse 32, and this is just let me back up to verse 31. So Saul's talking to Jonathan now. As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die. So this is interesting because if you think about it, it doesn't take a lot of brain power. The way that the kingship worked was a dynasty, right? The king's son would become the next king. So after Saul, who's in line for the king? It's Jonathan. Well, what's the threat to Jonathan being king potentially? It's David, because David's been anointed as the next king. So in Saul's mind, we get rid of David. That's how, Jonathan, you can be king. But the cool thing about Jonathan is he doesn't seem to care about being the king, right? And somebody who's desperate to be the king should never be the king. That's how spiritual leadership works. Whatever it is, whatever the place, the gift, the authority, the position, however you want to think about any of that, it's never about asserting oneself, one's power, one's desire in that way, right? Selfish desire, one's demands. It's always about anybody that God empowers, gifts, or raises up for any purpose in his kingdom is simply to see God's will done, right? And when we humble ourselves, and our deep desire is for people to see God's will be done, then we potentially are set up really well to honor God. But instead, so often it becomes about us, our power, our position, our authority. Don't disrespect me. Don't this kind of stuff. And it's just, there's some lessons I think we still need to learn here today, because there's a lot that's messed up in our world, whether it relates to politics, certainly, but even within churches. We see these power moves come back into play, and it's not good. It's not healthy, and we need to be willing to call it out. So, in any case, back to our narrative here, verse 32 of chapter 20. Why should he be put to death? Jonathan asks his father, the king. What has he done? Jonathan asks his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew. He's a really smart guy. After his dad threw a spear at him, then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David, right? So Jonathan, I think, wanted to hope the best for his father, wanted to hope that he could be reasoned with, that he would see the light, so to speak, that he was a little bit too in his own mind. We can convince ourselves of some crazy stuff in our own minds. And Jonathan loved that honor your father, he's king, he's father, all these reasons that Jonathan, again, is just, I think, a really good character. He did not want to dishonor his father. He did not want to dishonor his close friend David. He didn't want to dishonor God, right? So it's cool stuff. Chapter 21 and 22 is an interesting story. So this comes up in the New Testament as well, actually, when Jesus and his disciples are accused of not honoring the Sabbath by eating. And so Jesus mentions, let's just say, exceptions to the rule that went on. So David, I'm not going to kind of recount the story in detail, right? But David, he and his men are hungry. and the priests. So now we know about this stuff from Leviticus, right? Exodus, Leviticus, a lot about the tabernacle and what was supposed to go on there. Remember that bread of the presence, the how many loaves? 12, right? That represents the 12 tribes of Israel that were in the tabernacle. There was the lampstand, right, that shone the light on the 12 loaves of bread that represented the 12 tribes, God's light shining on them. And remember, this is a special table that this bread sat on, and every week it's rotated, right, with fresh bread. And so ultimately, and that bread is to be eaten by the priests. That's the, I didn't look up the verse in Leviticus, but it's there. That bread was supposed to be eaten by the priests, and it wasn't just for anybody that wanted it. And so David and his friends are offered it and eat it, and there's no concern given here really for that. And so Jesus makes reference back to this as well. So just one of those little instances of it's, I think, important for us to have the background for the things that Jesus references or other biblical writers reference in the New Testament. I think that's valuable stuff. So in chapter 22, in the big section in verse 6 and following, Saul is so angry about this, right? He blames the priest. Ultimately, he decides he wants all these priests. I mean, this is like, if you want to have just a stunning example of this, of the fall, of the sinfulness of Saul, this is it. And so he has, again, there's much more of this narrative. Hopefully you've read it and thought about it a little bit. He has all these priests killed because they helped David, his enemy. Priests, right? These were tabernacle. This is important stuff. And Saul is like, this is the remember back to the beginning of 1 Samuel. When you get a king, this is what you get, and they had a heavy lesson to realize, and they'll do that later, sort of as well. And so when David, on the flip side, right, we see that when David, as he has multiple times, had the opportunity where he could kill Saul, he doesn't do it. He won't do it. Why? Because he honors God. This is the Lord's anointed. Remember the Mashiach. He had the oil poured out on him. He's not lived up to that role at all. But still, David, he keeps himself in check. He's waiting a long time to come into the role that God's called him to. And so he becomes a much better example, of course, than Saul. And then, so that happens again in, chapter 26 as well. The last thing I want to mention today is I really like this story in chapter 25 involves David, a guy named Nabal, and his wife named Abigail. And this is a cool story. I like, I'll confess, I like the stories of, so how, in this ancient kind of patriarchal, whatever culture, like how do women show up? Like we saw Deborah, right, in the book of Judges. Like how do women do they fit into this kind of prescribed pattern, or how does that work? Or is it whatever? I just want to be observant to some of these things. So the story is so cool, I think. I'm curious what you guys think about the story of Abigail, Nabal, David. So this guy Nabal, he's loaded. He's got tons of stuff. David sends one of his guys over to ask him for some food, basically. And the guy says, "Who are you? Who is David?" Blah blah blah. He is not interested. He's very self-centered. And so David hears about it, and he's pretty agitated. So he's like, "All right, strap on your swords, guys. We're going to go show this guy what's up." So one of the servants tells Abigail, verse 14, Nabal's wife, about what happened, about the messenger that came and what he did. So we're told in verse 18, Abigail acted quickly. She took 2 loaves of bread, but basically she gathers up all of these supplies and rides out with them to meet David. Why? Because she knows that her husband's stupidity is going to lead to his and their potential death and destruction. So we have here this sort of interesting thing, like when sometimes people are like, well, you don't do anything without your husband, or you never go behind your husband or whatever like that. Well, that's not Abigail's story. She knows her husband is a fool. And so she does not consult him. She does not try to convince him, even in this case. Again, whether that would have been a good idea or not, doesn't say, but she takes action. And she goes to David, and she has a long speech here in verse 28. And following, and there's a lot of interesting things in here. So I'm trying to think about what I want to. If there's anything in particular I want to point out. Yeah. So she says, I'm in verse 25 of chapter 25. Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. This is her husband. Now, remember too, marriages were often, arranged marriages and this kind of thing, and there wasn't a lot of options, and there's a lot that could be said about that. That wicked man Nabal, he is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. So she said, don't take that guy seriously. Listen to what I have to say. And she says a lot of course, good things about David, about his future, and recognition of that, and that kind of thing. Offers some food. But one of the interesting things is, so look at this in verse 33. May you be blessed for your good judgment. So this is, all right, let me read verse 31. This is Abigail talking to David. My Lord will not have on his, let me back up, verse 30. When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord, that's talking about David, right? Every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord my God has brought my Lord success, remember your servant. So basically she's saying here that this is not really a righteous thing. Like when you become the king, like you may have this on your conscience, like regret going in and wiping out all these guys and, whatever, because you're agitated because he turned you down. Basically the idea is she's kind of saying this wouldn't really be a righteous thing. Couching it in very complimentary language, right? But it's interesting. So, all right, verse 32. What does David say? What does he not say? He doesn't say, who do you think you are going behind your husband's back? Who do you like? He's the man of the house. Who do you think you are saying that this might be on my conscience later? He doesn't say any of those things. Look what he says in verse 32. David said to Abigail, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you to meet me. Wow. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Let me just mention too down in verse 39. So ultimately, Nabal dies of natural causes or the Lord's direct doing, but it's not through David's sword. But look what David says then. I'm in verse 39. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head. Wow. So David's admitting here, Abigail was right. He was about to do wrong. And her action prevented him from doing that, and saved their camp, so to speak, from that happening. Her bold action. So yeah, Abigail. So what is So again, what does David think of Abigail as at the end of this? Her husband dies. Check this out. Verse 39. Then David sent word to Abigail asking her to become his wife. So again, what doesn't he say? He doesn't say, well, I don't want you for my wife because you didn't listen to your husband, right? It's not about listening to your husband. It's about being wise, intelligent, wanting to serve God and protect your family. And I think there's some lessons we can learn here from Abigail. And I think she challenges some of our assumptions of what we thought was kind of, the way of sort of the biblical wife, so to speak. So I don't know. I may be making too much of that, but I really enjoy this story. And I'm curious what you guys think about anything that we've talked about here today. Let's continue to engage in these stories together. Love you guys. Catch you later. Bye.